Everything we've been told about history is wrong. And how we got here is really a very interesting question to ponder.
There are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know.
How we got here as far as the control system goes is, of course, someone had an idea, put it into motion, and here we are. But when you look at the control system and you look at what we've really done since the Industrial Revolution, it's really quite miraculous. It really is. Even when you look at what we've done in the last 30 or 40 years, technology has simply snowballed. Some of the technology we're using now is stuff that was never dreamt of when I was a child. It was all science fiction when I was a child. This was stuff out of Flash Gordon and bizarre comic books. But even Flash Gordon and some of the bizarre comic books didn't have the stuff that we've got now. So you really have to wonder where it all comes from. The point is, what I'm saying here is you can't really date a lot of the information that we believe we can date, because all that really can be confirmed is that which exists within living memory. That's what we've got. You know, we don't really have any idea where we are, where we come from, or what's really going on here at all. And when you look at the growth of technology in the last 100 years, it really is quite amazing that we've managed to achieve what we've achieved, which again begs the question, where did it all come from? See, it's so difficult to get any real handle on history because there's been so much effort undertaken to destroy history. And really, that's what we're seeing now in the Middle East. I mean, why do you think they wage all these wars in the Middle East? It's because it's the cradle of civilization. And they're just destroying history all over the Middle East. They're destroying all the ancient artifacts they can, all the ancient cities they can, all the ancient structures that they can. Because the stuff that's there in the Middle East that they're bombing in Syria, places like Aleppo and Palmyra, these are far older than the places that you find in Europe. I mean, remember when they went into Iraq, one of the first things that the Allies did when they went into Iraq in the Gulf War was they looted the Baghdad Museum. And a lot of the artifacts from the Baghdad Museum were actually found scattered around the side of the road in certain back areas in the United States. All smashed to pieces, of course, but I remember some of these things even made the news, the fact that they were found. So they went in there specifically to destroy the history, to locate all the ancient artifacts that indicated there was any history, then just take them and destroy them. Many of these things were priceless and they didn't even sell them. They didn't sell them on the black market or anything. They just took them to destroy them. The question is why? Over the ages, there's been so many groups that have destroyed so much stuff. I mean, the burning of the Alexandrian Library, for example, which was burnt by one or two, possibly even three groups of people. Burnt by the Christians, burnt by the Arabs, burnt by anybody who wanted to burn it. You look at ancient Egyptian civilization, it seems to have sprung full-blown into being right from day one. That all seems perfectly normal. Look at Chinese civilization. That's always been an incredibly advanced civilization and always very hidden, and we don't know anything about where that came from because many Chinese emperors took it upon themselves to destroy all the history books that existed before them because they decided they would be the beginning of history and history should start with them and there should be no one before them. So they destroyed all of the ancient scrolls that existed before they were born, before they took rulership, so the history would start there. And I think a couple of emperors actually did that in China. So it's pointless looking there for any information. We may have got something from the Mayans, but the Spanish did a great job of destroying all of their information. We do have one or two codexes left, but people simply can't translate them properly. Of course, there's a rich history to be found in Europe, but God knows what it is, because Europe has been a war zone since recorded history even started. So it's very difficult to know what happened there, because there's been so many cultures come and go, and so many armies march across the land, and so much destroyed across Europe. And of course, as in the case with any good battle, history is written by the winners.
Indeed, it is true. It is the winners who write history. We come into this world and we are taught the stories of those who came before us, by those who say that they know, or have heard, from those who call themselves scholars. Everything we believe about this world is taught to us by those whom we accept as authorities. But what if those who rose to power had no interest in preserving the legacy of their predecessors, but rather to destroy and distort what came before them in order to secure their own position?
When Horemheb rose to power after the death of the pharaoh Akhenaten, he destroyed all references of the teachings of his predecessors.
In Rome, the erasure of inconvenient citizens was a verdict called damnatio memoriae that officially ordered the public to erase all evidence of a person's existence from historical records. When the Muslim Sultan Salahuddin conquered Egypt, he burned the Fatimid books present there in their entirety. Examples of historical distortion are countless, yet most people still choose to trust those in power to dictate to them what is true and what is false. History is perceived as a record of past events. However, what is chronicled could be fact or could be fiction. For the most powerful and cruel men of the past centuries, the distortion of history has been a very powerful tool to push forward their agenda and ideologies. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, is known to have said, "If you repeat a lie often enough, people will come to believe it, and you will come to believe it yourself." Napoleon Bonaparte has said, "History is a set of lies agreed upon." And Winston Churchill is recorded to have said, "History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it." Distorting history is an effective method of erasing events from the minds of the population, of glorifying events and people in support of state ideals, and vilifying events and people who are in conflict with it. Over time, knowledge of the truth will die with those who lived or witnessed it, and the alternative version will be universally accepted as true. This is not an isolated incident. Around 1336 before Christ, Pharaoh Akhenaten suffered a similar fate. Akhenaten became famous for being one of the first pharaohs to officially establish monotheism in the Egyptian society, a practice that was opposed by many influential Egyptian priests and scholars. While during his reign, he had already made many enemies for himself, it seems that those who succeeded him were just waiting for his death to reverse everything that he had fought to establish. After his death, his monuments were dismantled and hidden, his statues were destroyed, and his name excluded from the list of kings. Polytheism was gradually restored, and when some dozen years later rulers without clear rights of succession came from the 18th dynasty founded a new dynasty, they discredited Akhenaten and his immediate successors, referring to Akhenaten himself as, quote, the enemy, or that criminal in archival records. And again, those who intended to write history were successful. Akhenaten was all but lost from history until the discovery during the 19th century of the site of Akhenaten, the city he built and designed at Amarna. Egypt wasn't alone in this. The destruction of images by government decree in the Roman world is called damnatio memoriae. Such a decree meant that the name of the damned was scratched from inscriptions, his face chiseled off from statues, and that person was to be excluded from official accounts. It is unclear how many Romans have received the verdict of damnatio memoriae. As for many of them, there might truly be no remembrance left. Scratches in the ancient Roman carvings, as well as a few court records, show that it was a commonly implemented practice. This image clearly shows the erasure of the face of a family member, probably a child image of the Roman Emperor Geta. Although the practice might be understandable in some cases, like in the case of murderers or rapists, it soon became misused, and every ruler that did not like his predecessor, as well as every revolutionist who was considered a criminal by the ruling elite, was entirely erased from history.
We have a large number of scientific professionals working in the field of archaeology. They feel they know what they're doing. Like all scientists down through the ages, they have a reference frame that they work through. That reference frame becomes their definition of reality, and they find it very difficult to accept alternative points of view. I think it's as simple as that. I think that you can look at archaeology in terms of the history of science and see that science has often resisted new ideas.
Do these examples of history not pose the question if there are in fact essential parts of our history that have been distorted or entirely erased? Although the ancient Egyptians and Romans were not able to erase all of their condemned, they were most certainly able to erase some of them. And does this not make you wonder if the same practice is in place today? Fast forward more than 2,000 years to our modern society. For decades, curriculums in the Middle East and North Africa emphasized allegiance to longtime despots and versions of history that promulgated militaristic Arab nationalism. Political science was recast as the Green Book studies in Libya, referring to former dictator Muammar Gaddafi's nonsensical book of aphorisms about politics. When the despots were overthrown, revolutionists in return tried to erase their memory from history and rewrite history books to relate their crimes rather than whitewash them. After the Egyptian Revolution, a Cairo court ordered that images of the ousted Egyptian president Hosni Mubarak and his wife Suzanne, as well as their names, be removed from all public squares, streets, libraries, and other public institutions around the country. Another very public attempt to distort and shape history are book burnings. They are a very public display of an attempt to wipe out certain ideas and accounts from the mind of an entire populace, and this occurred very frequently throughout history. A well-known classical example is the book burning initiated by Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, who ordered most previously existing books to be burned in order to avoid scholars' comparison of his reign with the past. Beginning in 213 BC, all classical works of 100 schools of thought, except those from Qin Shi Huang's own school of philosophy, were subject to book burning. The practice of book burning was also used effectively by European colonialists. When they conquered foreign lands and subdued its people, it was common practice to destroy the historical accounts of the indigenous people. Spanish conquistadors burned all the texts of the Maya in 1562. Diego de Landa was the man responsible for the destruction of all sacred Maya texts and is quoted to have said, "We found a large number of books in scripture, and, as they contained nothing in which there were not to be seen superstition and lies of the devil, we burned them all." This event is known as the Great Maya Book Burning and is considered by many historians to be the greatest loss of ancient knowledge of the peoples of Mesoamerica. But ironically, the very person who created so much destruction of knowledge, Diego de Landa, is also credited as being the greatest chronicler of the Maya and the one who can be credited with most of what people know today about the indigenous people.
History is written by the winners. And all you've got to really do is go and travel around the world and look at stuff to see the truth of this. I mean, nothing is what they tell us it is. None of it makes sense. Nothing that they tell us makes sense. But when were they there is the question. Was it all really as long ago as what we think it was? And again, that may seem like a very strange question to ask, but I don't know, folks. I mean, everything we've been told is a lie, so you have to question this as well. You know, and the fact that it's so difficult to really discover too much about the Earth is what has promoted the concept of things such as the Flat Earth Society, the Flat Earth Movement, which has done so much damage to the resistance. It really has. Just the distrust and the divide and conquer and the insults and all the stuff that goes with it. I mean, you can research whatever you want, but you don't have to insult others while you do it. But even when looking at it, you can't blame the Flat Earthers for what they do. You really can't, because there's so much wrong with the model that we're given. I mean, it doesn't mean it's flat, but there's certainly a lot wrong with what we're told is going on here. So you can understand where they've got the fuel for the fire that they're burning at the moment. And that's why the Flat Earthers and the Globe Earthers have got to put down all this fighting with each other and realise that they're both being played and they both have a common enemy, which is the one that created the mystery to begin with. And all we have to do is to realise that all this stuff we're looking at, nobody really knows for sure, and all we have to do is agree to disagree and get a little bit of focus. Because one thing we do know, the world is run by criminals. And if we get a little bit of focus there, we're at a time in history where I believe we can actually fix it. Of course, there's two popular schools of thought on where we come from. There are others, but there's the two most popular, which of course is evolution or creationism. I personally don't particularly buy into either of them. Evolution is completely ridiculous. I mean, even Charles Darwin said it was a theory, and there's so many missing pieces that it just doesn't fit together. I mean, the concept that we would have come from apes and gorillas is ridiculous, because these things still exist, and so do we, and there's never been any transitional species found, and there never will be. And there's so many differences between us and gorillas and apes that it just beggars belief that they could even have suggested it to begin with. You know, and they'll present it to you and make it sound all very believable, and they'll say things like, look, there's only 1% difference in the DNA between apes and humans, so there's a close cousin. What they don't tell you is there are 20 billion base pairs in the human DNA, and so 1% of that is 20 million base pairs, and no matter how you look at it, that's a huge difference between species, folks. There's a great book that was put out by Lloyd Pye called Everything You Know Is Wrong, where he went through the whole plethora of differences between us and apes and virtually proved that evolution from apes is impossible for humans. So that theory really doesn't work, no matter what people might say and no matter how much it's promoted by the mainstream. Of course, the other theory is creationism. I don't particularly buy into that, but some people do. But of course, it's one of those theories that you can't really debate, you can't really offer proof of, it simply rests on faith. And so that just depends on your religious perspective. Those who choose to believe it do, and those who choose not to don't. But the thing is, even with either of those theories, none of them really explain. Neither of them explain all the ruins that are lying around everywhere, and none of them explain why they've gone to such an incredible amount of effort to hide history from us. And if you don't think they have hidden history, folks, if you think I'm sort of stretching it by even saying that, well, just ask yourself why all these things exist all around the earth, why all these monuments are there, and why they're all hushed up and we're not told about them. And of course, you've got a whole group of people, such as David Icke even will tell you that the whole place is run by reptiles.
World governments are controlled by a reptilian, non-human race.
And of course, that sounds completely preposterous to people, and then you start looking through all the ancient texts, and you start looking through all the cave drawings and all the stuff that you hear from the Native Americans and all this sort of stuff, and they all talk about reptiles and their snake brothers. You also hear it from the Australian Aboriginals. But again, you got to wonder how much of it has simply been put there. How much of them are real and how many have been concocted. That's the thing, you just don't know. And getting back to the concept that the Earth has been invaded and is being strip mined, you could even ask yourself whether the Flat Earth movement was introduced right at the time they are finishing their mining operations to make people believe that space doesn't exist and that aliens are impossible. And the thing is, you can prove just about all of it to be true, but that doesn't make any of it so. And you see how easy that was to just construct a believable scenario. And some people may say, oh no, that's not believable. But well, you know, if you're a conspiracy theorist, then maybe it is believable. That's the thing, folks. You just don't know. See, any scenario could be true, And the thing is, folks, that if you really get out there and you start looking at all the information and you start gathering information, you start preparing yourself some type of a presentation or whatever, you can prove anything you want to prove. That's the thing. Like I said, you can prove that it's all about flat Earth, or you can prove that it's all about globe Earth. You can prove the Earth has been invaded. You can prove that the flat Earth was introduced to cover up the fact that the Earth is invaded. And you can prove all of those things, plus you can prove a whole bunch of other things as well. You can prove that there's reptiles living under the ground and controlling everything from under the Earth. You can prove that it's all run by the Jews. You can prove that it's all run by the Jesuits. You can prove that it's all run by the Freemasons. You can prove that it's all a hologram. But the thing is, you can only prove any of it up to a certain point. But you can prove it enough to make it believable and to get other people to believe it. And you can only do that because they've hidden history, and the fact is that we don't know. Any one of the scenarios that I've outlined for you today is true. I can prove it. But that doesn't make any of it true. Because the reason I can prove any of them to be true is because all the information has been put out there to be able to create a believable scenario about anything you choose to believe.